about halfway down on the Amid, but the wide lines, the 6th, 7th wide line. Tana Rabbanan. Kol Shirois v'Sishbachais. She'amar David b'Sefer Tilim. What David said in Sefer Tilim, Rabbi Lezer Omer Kineged Atzman Amra. That is for the individual, it was said for. And Rabbi Shua Amar Kineged Tzibur Amra. It was said for the Tzibur, for Klal Yisrael. V'chachamim Aimrim, Yesh Behem Kineged Tzibur. Some of the Tehillim is Kineged Tzibur. V'yesh Behem Kineged Atzmai. So therefore, Hamur is B'Lashon Yachid, it's obvious Kineged Atzmai. Hamur is B'Lashon Rabim, is Kineged Tzibur. Then when it says in Tilim, Nitzuach, Lamatzeach, right? Or it says Vinigon, Viniginus. That is Laset Lavai. And Maskil is Aidei Torgaman. Was David HaMelech said it and somebody else explained it. When it says David Mizmar, then it's Malamish Yashar Sol of Shechina. The Shechina was there. V'achakach Amar Shira. Then they started saying Shira. But when it says Mizmar LeDavid, like we say on Shabbos, Melamed Shama Shira, they started Shira and then V'achakach Shar Sol of Shechina. L'amdecha She'ein HaShechina Shora. The Shechina doesn't rest within Klal Yisrael. Loi b'teich atzlus, laziness. Loi b'teich atzfus. If it's sad, loi b'teich schoik, too much laughter. Loi b'teich kalas roish. Loi b'teich dvarim b'teilim. Ella b'teich dvar simcha shel mitzvah. In other words, there has to be simcha. In other words, when you start singing and when you're happy with music, then the simcha, then bati Allah yad Hashem. That's when the Shechina is shora. When somebody is sitting down for halacha to learn, also you should do it b'toich simcha. You should do it in simcha. Amar Rav Nachman, v'chein l'chaloim toiv. When you're going to sleep and you are happy, let's say your hockey team won last night and you're happy, you'll have a good dream, right? Fredi Gemara, Eini, Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav, Kol Talmud Chacham Hayoshev. In other words, now we're saying that you should be happy when you're learning, but it says Kol Talmud Chacham Hayoshev Nei Rabbi. If you're sitting in front of your Rebbe, ve'ein savasav noitfais. Mar, and your lips are not like bitter, like shaking with fear. If you don't have that, you will be burnt. Shenemas vasav shoshanim noitvis mar oiver. Al tikra shoshanim el shoshonim. A person that learns, and val tikra mar arver el mar avar. In other words, it will be bitter. So, in other words, you have to have, when you're learning, you have to be bitter. You can't be too happy, right? So the Gemara answers like kasha. It all depends. Ha berabba. In other words, the Rebbe should be a lebedika Rebbe, a happy Rebbe, right? And ha betamidai, but the student should have a little fear, right? And that is who should be happy, who should not be that simchadik. V'ibay zeima ha v'ha berabba v'lei kasha. It's talking both ha bekamid pasach before you sit down. In other words, then the Rebbe is there and he comes on time. He starts with a joke, right? But once you start learning, in other words, there should be ema. Rabba, before he sat down for his talmidim, Amar Milsa Bifusai, he said something funny. And then the Rabbanan, all the classmates laughed. We're happy. Then they started learning Upasach Bishmaita. And that's what every rabbi's drush is, right? You start off with a joke to make everybody happy. But really, the reason why you start with a joke is you get everybody's attention. In other words, before they fall asleep, you want to get them going, right? That's the thing. Tan Rabbanan. Hallel zeh mi amra. That Hallel, you tease the rabbi every morning, Reb Shlomo, when you come in with a good cup of coffee. You got to come in with two. Hallel zeh mi amra.
The rabbi brings his own.
Oh, but it doesn't smell as good as that one. Hallel zeh mi amra. Amra Reb Lezer Aimer. The Hallel that we say, let's say by Rosh Chodesh, we say it by Pesach. Who said that? Moshe v'Yisrael amru b'shosh amdu al hayom. When they were by the Yam Suf, and Haim amru. So Klal Yisrael said to Hashem, Leilanu Hashem Leilanu. In other words, we're not worthy of Kriyas Yamsuf. Meshiva Ruach HaKodesh v'Amar Lemani Yaseh. I'm really doing this for my sake. I want you to be my people. Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, it wasn't Klal Yisrael and Moshe that said it was Yeshua v'Yisrael Amru. They said it. V'shosh Amda Aleim Malchei Canaan. So also Hein Amru Leilanu Meshiva. Now the Rashbam says Yeshua v'Chol Yisrael Amru. It means Kloima Af Yisrael v'Yeshua. Not only Moshe and Klal Yisrael said it, but also later on Yisrael and Yeshua said it. But then Rashbam says Lei Niri. And then he says that actually every time is saying it didn't happen before, it only happened at that period of time. And we'll see other times. Rabbi Lazar, Hamaydai Amra, Devaira, Barak Amru, Bishosh Amalev, Sisrei, Aim Amru. They said, Lailanu, we're not right for a Nes, for a Hakaidish Meshiva, by Emeris Lehem, Lamani as Rabbi Lazar ben Azaria Imer, Chizkiah Visiyato Amru, and his group said it, Bishosh Amar Alev, Sancherev, Aim Amru, also Lailanu, Umeshiva. Rabbi Akiva Imer, Hanani Mishal Vazari Amru, Bishosh Amar Aleim Nebuchadnezzar HaRasha, when they were thrown into the Kifshan Eish. Heim Amru Leilanu, Umeshiv, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered, it's Lemani. Rabbi Yosef Glili Imer, Mordechai ve'Esther Amru, Bishosh Amar Aleim Haman HaRasha, Heim Amru Leilanu, Umeshiva. So according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, Purim we don't say Hallel, but according to this, if that was the Iker Hallel, you know, everybody has truths, and why Hanukkah we say Hallel and why Purim, right? Yeah. But here, according to Rabbi Saglili, we should say Hallel on Purim. We had this yesterday. Every tzara, but Rashi, if you look at the second wide line on the top, in the middle it says Lishna Mal Yehud Nakat. It doesn't mean that the tzara came already, but the Nevi'im are masakin that in the future, when you have a tzara coming and you will help us, Aisal Gulasan going Chanukah in the future. So I'll call tzara Leitav Aleim Yisrael Sheniglu Aimrim Aisana Gulasan. Okay, Amar Rav Chizda. Hallelujah. When you say Hallelujah is Saif Perika. When it's only one Hallelujah between one parak and another parak, then the Hallelujah is the end of the first one. And Rav Huna Amar, no, Hallelujah, when it says in between two parakim, is Reish Perika. It's really the start of the next one. Amrav Chizda Chasina Le'Tile the Rav Chanan. We saw that also yesterday. I saw the Tilim of Rav Chanan, Barav. And there, the Ksibbe Hallelujah be'emtza Perika. It said it's somewhere in between the two parakim. Because Alma Sapke wasn't sure, does it go to the previous one, the end of the first one, or the beginning of the second one? So he actually put it in the middle somewhere on the parchment. Amrav Chanu Barabba, Hakol Maidim, by Tilas Hashem Yidaba Pi, Vivarech Abosim Kochel Olam Voed, that when you say Hallelujah, it's the Basrei of the Reish Pirka. It's really going on the next Reish Pirka. And really, we end up with a pasuk of Anachnu Nevarech, but really the end of Ashrei is Tilas Hashem. So when you say Hallelujah, it's really the start of the next one. Right? And also when it says Rasha Yira Viklas Sheinav Yecharek Vinimas Tavas Risham Ta'ove Hallelujah, that's the Basrei. Hallelujah the Basrei at the end is the Reish Pirka of the next one. Misha'indim Beis Hashem Hallelujah is also the Basrei Reish Pirka. And Karoi Mosifin, Rashi at the last line in the Rashbam says Bal Mikra Mosifim Af Elu. In other words, the people that knew the Chumash, the Tanakh, they were Moisef Af as Elu. They said this pasuk Menachem Baderech Yishtak and Yoram Roish. What we say right before Musaf of Arachamim, that Hallelujah the Basrei the Reish Pirka. Reish is Chachma Yeres Hashem Shekol Toiv L'Chol Asayim. Hallelujah is the Basrei Reish Pirka. Now Rashi says, Rashbam, Hallelujah the Reish Pirka, that's only in the Sefer Tehillim, She'ein Bo Elokim Achas Levade Ben Perek LePerek. Avol Makim She'esh Shnei Pamim Hallelujah, where you have there's an end and a beginning of Hallelujah, Ben Perek LePerek, like Pliger of Chizar Rav Ravana. Because one really goes on, both of them don't go on the previous one, or both of them, they don't argue that it goes both on the next one. It means you split up. One goes on the previous one, and the other Hallelujah, it goes on the next one. Name it Ketanoi. Ad Heichen, we learned to Oimer. In other words, when you're saying the Haggadah before Shulchan Aruch, so you say a part of Hallel. So we learned yesterday, Beishamai says, you say it Ad Eim Abanim Semecha. That's where you end off. And Beis Hillel Oimrim Ad Chalamish L'mayim Mayim. V'tanya Yidach. So that is the end of the parak of Tilim. V'tanya Yidach, then another brayse Ad Heichen U'Oimer, Beishamai Oimrim Ad B'tzeisis Somim Mitzrayim. In other words, he starts with the beginning. Beis Hillel Oimrim Ad Loilanu Hashem Loilanu. So what is the machlekes? My lab hakemiflagi. The manda that says Ad Eim Abanim Semecha. So he ends off. Therefore, he holds Salvar Halaluka. It means Reish Pirka is going on the next one. Umanda Amar Ad B'Teis Yisrael, because the Halaluka that you said before is Seif Pirka, is a continuation of the previous one. Right? So you have a machlekes Tanaim. So Rav Chizda will come along and say, no, it doesn't have to really be a machlekes Tanaim. Now, normally, when the Gemara says name it Katanoi, it's really a question. Because the question is, if you have an Amayra, Rav Chizda, what are you getting involved in Tanaim's machlekes? Right? In other words, what you're saying is based on a machlekes Tanaim. So big thing. What did you come along and say a chiddush? What's a machlekes Tanaim? That's why Gemara is saying no. Rav Chizda is going to say my memra is l'kula Tanaim, is according to everybody. That's what's Mataros Tamei. The Gemara really says Rav Chizda Mataros Tamei the Kuli Am Savri Haluka means Saif Pirka. Haluka goes at the end of that parak. So Mandam B'Teis Israel, that makes sense. Shapim, because the Haluka was from before. But Mandam Amar Ad Eim Haban Semecha, you're going to answer Ad V'Ad B'Chlal. When it says Ad Eim Haban Semecha, means that you continue and say the Haluka with it. So for the Gemara, why don't you make it a little simple? But name Ad Haluka. Why do you say Ad Eim Haban Semecha if Haluka is connected to that parak? So say Ad Haluka. V'chitei Madle Dinan. Hey, Aluka, if you're going to say Aluka, I might think that you're saying from the next one. So V'neima, say it simple. Haluka shel eim abanu semecha. So the Gemara says Kasha. So that's how Rav Chizda is mataritz his memra according to the Tanaim. And Rav Huna mataritz tamei. The Kuli Alma Haluka is the Reish Perika. Haluka really goes on to the next parak, the new one. Mando amad eim abanu semecha shapir, because he doesn't say Haluka really is to the next one. You don't say that before Shulchan Aruch. Mando amad b'teis Yisrael, because he holds Savar Ad v'loy ad b'chlal. So therefore, again, the same question. V'neima ad haluka. V'chiteima d'le'adirei haluka. I won't know if it's the which one it is. So v'neima, come out and say ad haluka sheb'seis Yisrael. The Gemara says kasha. Okay, v'chosein b'geula, and you end off the bracha of Goal Yisrael, right before Shulchan Aruch. Amar Rava. So Rava makes a statement. Krishma. When you're talking about geula of Krishma, right? And Rashi says that the Birchas Geula She'acha Krishma, before Shemon Esrei, Yisrael Tzur Yisrael, right? You say Baruch Hashem Goal Yisrael. So that Goal Yisrael of the Hallel and the Hallel of Erev Pesach that you end off with Goal Yisrael. In other words, Gemara says you say Goal, you say the lashon of Goal of the past, and if the Tzelusa. But the one that we are davening, in davening, that is Goyel Yisrael. That is on the future. My time in the Rachmininu. Rashi says, Shana Mispalam ala Asid, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should help us. Amr Abzera, also the Kedusha of Kiddush, we say, Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvahs of Tzivanu. Right? So something on the past. And the Tzelusa, in davening, we say, Kachenu mitzvahsecha. Right? We're saying it in the middle of davening. The Rashbam says, "B'loshen b'akasha." That is matamid derachmininu. It's something that we want from Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Amar of Acha bar Yaakov etzorach sheyaski yitzias mitzrayim b'kiddush hayoyim. When you're saying kiddush, you have to remember yitzias mitzrayim. Rashi says, Bein b'kois, when you're doing kiddush on the wine, and bein b'tfilah shel Shabbos, also you have to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why? Ksiv hachal leman tiskar es yoyim teischem eretz Mitzrayim, and ksiv hasam by Shabbos it says Zachor es yom Shabbos l'kagel shoy. So we make a gzeir shava. Amar Rabbi Bar Shila the Tzelusa. We say Matzmiach Karen Yeshua. In davening, we say Matzmiach Karen Yeshua, and the Aftarta of the Maftir, we say Mogain David. Right? Okay, look at Rashi. DAF Tarta Mesech L'Seif from Tanya Lo L'Brachis DAF Torah Mefarish that you end up in saying the Magen David Aimer. Uvitzalusa by davening when you're talking about David Amel Shaykh Loimet Tzvi, you say more Matzmiach Ken Yeshua. Why? Because you add on more Mishum Derach Beninu. Ba'anu Mevakshin Sheyatzmiach Ken Yeshua Yisrael. But he brings down Rabbeinu Shlomo. Rashi said, why don't we say, instead of Matzmiach Ken Yeshua, why don't you say, end off with Magen David? Because Shekfar Marnu Magen Avraham. You already said Magen Avraham in the beginning. And therefore, V'trecha Simus Kadadi, two endings in a bracha, in Shemona Esrei, L'shayach B'tfila, you shouldn't say it. So therefore you say, you say Matzmiach Ken Yeshua, you don't say Magen David. And then the pasuk back to the Gemara says, "Vasisa l'cha shem gadol kishem agdolim." The Rashbam explains that Nasan Hanavi is telling Hakadosh Baruch Hu telling David HaMelech that Hakadosh Baruch Hu is going to make you as great as the Avos. Tana Rabbi Yosef Zeh Shoimrim Magen David. In other words, that David is just as great as the Avos. Was Amr Rab Shimon ben Lakish. In this past week's parsha it says Ve'eschol Gadol Zeh Shoimrim Alkei Avram. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling Avraham Avinu, I'm going to make you great through your children. And Rashi brings this down, this Gemara in Rashi. I might think that you might end off with Magen Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov. No, I'll only end off with Magen Avraham Vein Chaismin Bekulam. Right? And that makes Avram happy. So they ask a question. In other words, it says in the Gemara about Kol Miskanan, and you're always jealous with somebody. From your own son, you're happy. Anything he does something even better than you, you're happy. So why is Avram feeling so good? Oh, God's telling him, I'm not going to end off with your kids. I'm going to end off with you. Just the opposite. He'll have more nachas if you say his children, not him. So what is the Beheya bracha? So they explain, when it comes, they say, talking about in later generations, we might think that their approach to life, the way Yitzchak approached life, and Yaakov approached life, maybe that's the right way. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, no, we need your approach. We need Avram's approach. No, we have to end off with you. In today's generation, you have to be on Avram. That opens up his tent to everybody. He's Gemilas Chesed. That's the only way. You can't be, they explain, like a Yitzchak that was like a har, was more enclosed, and Yaakov was a sadeh. You have to be open. In other words, just the opposite. Sorry, Avram is the har. In other words, Yitzchak is the sadeh, and Yaakov is the bias. So in other words, you have to be open to everybody. That's pshat.
Whose word is that?
I saw it years ago, but it's a nice word. Amarava. That's why I said it on camera. Amarava. Ashkichinu l'sabed to Medusa. Rava says, I saw the altar of Medusa, the Yasvei the Kamre. They sat and they said b'Shabsa. In other words, on Shabbos, bein b'tzlusa, by their davening, or bein b'kedusha, they said mikadosh Shabbos. B'yom tova yantiv, that's not Shabbos, bein b'tzlusa, bein b'kedusha, by their davening and by kiddush, they said mikadosh Yisrael v'azmanim. That's what the Sabed ben Bedusay said, the Alta. Rava says, I said Adarabba, the other way. The Tzelusa, bein b'Shabsa, bein b'Yontiv, by davening of it Shabbos or Yontiv, we should say Mikadosh Yisrael. B'Kedusha the Shabbos, we should say Mikadosh Shabbos. And b'Yontiv, by Kiddush, you should say Mikadosh Yisrael v'Azmanu. So Rava said it should be different than them. And Rabba is saying, and I'll explain Taimi the D, I'll explain my Shita, and Taimi the Tchu and your Shita. And right away he explains their Shita first. Taimi the Tchu, in other words, the Sabid the Budisa, Shab is the Kviya, B'Kaime. In other words, you don't need Bezdin to be Kaveya, it's automatic. Shabbos comes automatic. So therefore, Bein B'Tzlus, Bein B'Kedusha, you say Mikadosh Shabbos. But Yontiv, the Yisrael, the Kavalei, the Yisrael is Kaveyed. Why? The Kuma'abra Yarche. They make an extra month, the Kaveh Lishane, and they make if it's a leap year or not. So therefore, there you say Mikadosh Yisrael v'Azmanim. That is their reason. But time of the D, in other words, Rav is saying the way I say it, because Tzelusa, davening is the Barab Misa, then you say Mikadosh Yisrael. In other words, the covered Rabbin Rashbam says, you say Mikadosh Yisrael, the whole Klal Yisrael. Kiddush, the Yachid, Kiddush is Yachid, Isa, so therefore B'Shabbos Mikadosh Shabbos, and B'Yontiv Mikadosh Yisrael Vazmanim. So Rav is explaining his way, but V'lohi.
How come the Gemara jumps to the concept of the leap year? They're Makadosh every Rosh Chodesh.
Yeah, that's why it started first. Right, it said, if you look at the Lashon, right, it said the Yisrael hu the Kavaleh, Yisrael's Kaveya, and not only that, which is every Rosh Chodesh, and then the Kamabre Yarche, and then they make an extra month, and therefore the Kavaleh Shaneh, and therefore through that. So that's the order. So he explained his shita, but then he says, "V'loi." The Gemara says, "No, Tzelusa biyachid milesa." What, you think there's only davening berabim, or somebody doesn't daven by himself sometimes? And the kiddush berabim milisa. And why? There's not a kiddush. In other words, the kiddush is only in your house. Sometimes you come to shul. There's a big kiddush on Shabbos, right? Rashi says the kiddush of berabim is the Beis HaKnesses. I don't know if it means the Friday night kiddush. It doesn't mean the Shabbos kiddush, or it means the Sudas Chasen. By a chasana, everybody's there. So, in other words, on a Shabbos, V'Rava Zil, the Gemara says, Sava Zil Basa Iker. No, you go Basa the Iker, and that's why he changed the Nusach. Ula, Gemara says, Ba'arav Nachis Kamei de Rava. In other words, Ula came into Rava's shul, and Amar Kisabitim B'disa. And Rava, he didn't correct him. Alma, so you see from here that Hadebe Rava had Charata, what he said, and he held like the Nusach of the Sabitim B'disa. Rav Nasan Avur, the Rav Huna, Bre Rav Nasan, Nachas Kamei de Rav Papa. He came to Rav Papa, and Amar Kisabitim B'disa, and it says, the Shavche Rav Papa praised him the way his nusach was. Amar Ravina, Ana Iklal Asura, Kamei to Meremar. I came to Meremar, and Menachem Kamei Shliach to Tzibura, and I was the Shliach Tzibur, V'Amar, Kisabet Disa, and guess what? The whole shul was yelling at me, you're doing it the wrong way. Amalahum. So Meremar says, Shafku, leave him, Hilchasa Kisabet Disa, and V'Lahavim Shaskale. And they actually listened to their rabbi. In other words, and they did not scream at him. In other words, the Mishnah says, Maskele Kais Shlishi. Okay, we're back to the Seder. Once you fill up your third kais, Mivarach al Mizayna, you do that for Birchas HaMazon. And Revi, when you have the fourth one, is Goimel Zahalel. V'Omer Olav Birchas Hashir. You say the Birchas Hashir, and we will see that in the Gemara right away. What is Birchas Hashir? So then the Mishnah says, Ben HaKaisis Halalu, between the first kaisis, in Raizel Lishlas Yishta. So in other words, if you want to drink by the two first kaisis, now the Rashbam explains, Ben HaKaisis Halalu, means bein shnayim or rishayim mishnayim achreinim. When you drank the first two, you're allowed, and then you have the next two, the last two. Between the first two and the last two, you're allowed to drink in between. Right? How about, which is a suda? But if you read bein hakais alalu, you could also read it between the first and the second.
Or the third and fourth.
Well, no. Then the Mishnah says, one second. In Raizel Lishtais, bein shlishi levi lo yishta. It says. Now the question is, the Rashbam explains between the first two and the second two. How about between the first and the second? Are you allowed to drink? So it doesn't say that here, so you're going to have to look into what the halach is on that. Amalei Gemara says, Amalei Rav Chanan l'Rava, Shmami na, since we say that when you're benching with the kais shlishi, it's mashma, Shmami na birchas hamazayin, tunin kais. It's mashma, you need a kais. So Gemara says, no. Amalei, when it says here you need a kais, not because of benching. Amalei arbi kasa tiknu rabbanan derecheres. On Seder night, there's a chiyuv to have 4 cups. Right? So kol chad v'chad never by mitzvah. So here at Seder night, I'm going to put one of the kaises that I'm mechuyev al Pesach. I'll do it with benching. But really, during the year when you're benching, who says it's a raya that you need a kais? Right? We learned previously about the 8 things that they learned from Mishnah. But from here, there's no raya. The Mishnah says, Revi goimel of Zahalel and v'oimel olav birchas hashir. So what is the birchas hashir? Rav Yehuda Eimer, you end off with Yahaluka Hashem Elokeinu. And Rabbi Yechanan Amar, you say Nishmas Kol Chai. So in our Agada, actually, we combine them both. the Yahaluka and that. And the Taisa says in the top, the Kamash Malon, the Afilu ben Makaim, Shloi Nago Levarach Achrav, even though normally you don't say Yahaluka at the end of Hallel, but Beleil Pesach, Tzarech Levarach. Right? The Inago, if it's everybody's minute by a regular Hallel to say Yahaluka, so Pshita, what's the Chiddush here? Inami, Afilu ben Makim Shenago, maybe have a minute DAF Yamim. Maybe during the day when you say Hallel. But maybe Balayla, you don't say Yahaluka, Ain't Tzarech Levarach. Kamash Malon here, the Gemara says that what? That you do say Yahaluka. And there's minhagim by Yom Ha'atzmaut, when you say Hallel, a lot of people don't say the bracha in the beginning and the last bracha too, right? The last paragraph, which is the Chasimas bracha. But somebody that's so Zionistic, he will say it, right?
My brother-in-law says with a bracha, the whole thing.
Baruch Hashem, he lives in Eretz Yisrael. And we'll end off here.